You wake to the toll of chapel bells echoing through long corridors of stone, their bronze voices carrying the weight of centuries. It is the year 1491, and you serve in the court of Queen Isabella of Castile, the most powerful woman in Christendom. Your bare feet skim the cold marble floors as you hurry through the Alcazar of Segovia, carrying a basin of rose water and a fresh strip of linen. The air tastes of incense, and of something else. Something sour, organic, that makes your stomach churn. Outside the royal chamber you pause. Through the heavy oak door you can hear her voice, a steady river of Latin prayers, punctuated by the soft click of rosary beads sliding between her fingers. She has been kneeling for hours. You push the door open and the air strikes you like a blow. It is a cocktail of burning frankincense, sweat, and the raw animal tang of decay. There she is, Isabella, still in the same white linen shift she wore the day Granada fell under siege 3 months ago. Once bright as snow, the cloth now hangs heavy, its fibers darkened by sweat and speckled with dried blood from her own self-flagellation. Stains, darker and unnameable, cling to the folds around her body. As you set down the basin, your eyes catch a movement. Small, dark specks crawling across the yellowed fabric, fleas. Dozens of them, living, breeding, thriving upon the queen herself. You know better than to interrupt. To speak too soon might invite not only her wrath, but the judgment of the court, where even the smallest affront could be twisted into treason. Yet as you stand there, the reality is unavoidable. The Queen of Spain, whose word bends kingdoms and commands armies, is rotting slowly inside her own garments. And she chooses this. The story you are living is not entirely true, nor entirely false. For centuries a myth has clung stubbornly to Isabella's memory, that she vowed never to change her undergarments until Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, fell to her armies. Some versions stretch the vow to months, others to years. Some say it was not Isabella at all, but another Spanish monarch twisted by the chroniclers of the age. The details shift like sand, yet the image remains indelible, a queen so devout, so consumed by piety, that she embraced filth as holiness. Modern historians dismiss the tale as exaggeration, perhaps even propaganda. To her supporters, it sanctified Isabella as a martyr of faith. To her enemies, it painted her as a fanatic drowning in self-inflicted decay. But the very survival of this legend across 500 years tells us something important about the world she inhabited. A world where holiness and horror intertwined, where suffering was worship, and where the boundary between devotion and madness blurred until it vanished. To understand why such a myth felt believable, we must enter the late medieval mind. We must descend into a Spain where bathing was condemned as dangerous, where the sweat of saints was praised as perfume, and where even the most powerful rulers lived in conditions that would horrify the poorest among us today. Isabella's white linen, crawling with fleas, is more than a garment. It is a symbol. A fabric of faith stretched thin over a body in pain, a veil of sanctity that also reeks of rot. And so we step into her world, not the sanitized portraits of royalty, but the hidden reality where faith was measured in sores and scars, and where the fate of kingdoms hung on the prayers of a queen kneeling in her own filth. To make sense of Isabella's world, we must first understand the peculiar relationship medieval Spain held with cleanliness. In her lifetime, soap and water were not the mark of refinement, but of suspicion. To wash too often was to invite whispers of heresy. To remain unwashed, by contrast, could be a mark of holiness. This notion did not emerge in a vacuum. For centuries, the Iberian Peninsula had been a battlefield of cultures. On one side, the Christian kingdoms of the north, clinging to their faith as the foundation of identity. On the other, the Islamic rulers of Al-Andalus, whose cities gleamed with aqueducts, fountains, and bathhouses. In the Muslim south, water was not merely a necessity, it was sacred. 5 times a day, before bowing toward Mecca, the faithful washed. Ablution was prayer. Cleanliness was half of faith itself, as the Quran declared. Walk into Córdoba or Granada in the 15th century, and you would find the hammam, domed chambers of warm steam, marble basins, tiled floors. These public baths were not dens of sin, but places of community. Merchants struck deals while reclining in heated pools, poets composed verses between rinses, friends gossiped while scrubbing away the dust of the day. The architecture itself was a fusion of Roman engineering and Islamic artistry. Stone aqueducts, clay pipes, water flowing as if conjured from the desert. To wash here was to step into a tradition stretching back to antiquity. But north of these cities, in the lands Isabella inherited, bathing had become a moral danger. Church authorities declared that water cleansed more than the body, it weakened the soul. A freshly scrubbed body was thought porous, its protective oils washed away, leaving the faithful exposed to demons. Even the early church fathers had thundered against bathing. Saint Jerome wrote that, "He who is bathed in Christ needs no second bath." To wash beyond baptism was unnecessary. Worse, it was heretical. By Isabella's time, public bathhouses in Christian lands were shuttered, their reputation poisoned. Priests warned that these steamy halls were not houses of health, but houses of lust. In the dim light and mingling of unclothed bodies, social barriers dissolved, noble and peasant, man and woman, Christian and Jew. To the church, such mingling was unthinkable. Worse still, bathing was associated with outsiders, Jews, Muslims, and the lingering shadow of pagan Rome. To wash was to risk being mistaken for the enemy. And so a reversal took root. What the South praised as divine purity, the North condemned as sinful indulgence. Dirt became virtue. The smell of sweat and old garments was not a shame, but a badge of faith. In this world, to perfume oneself was vanity, to bathe was pride, but to stink was sanctity. Imagine the dissonance for a traveler in this divided land, moving from the jasmine-scented courtyards of Granada, where water shimmered in carved fountains, to the cold stone chapels of Castile, where incense mixed with the human musk of bodies that had not touched water in months. In one world, purity was ritualized washing. In the other, purity meant never washing at all. This was the Spain that shaped Isabella's mind, a land split not only by politics and war, but by water itself. A queen raised to believe that filth was a form of devotion, who looked upon the baths of her Muslim enemies not as marvels of civilization, but as temptations of the devil. To her, and to many of her contemporaries, the dirt upon the skin was not an absence of care, but a presence of faith. This collision of worlds, the sacred steam of Islam and the sanctified filth of Christendom, would ripple through every aspect of Isabella's reign, from the way she prayed to the way she waged war. And it would linger, quite literally, on her very skin. Isabella was born in 1451 in the Castilian town of Madrigal de los Altos Torres, the daughter of King John II of Castile and Isabella of Portugal. Her earliest memories were not of gleaming palaces or perfumed gardens, but of a world stained by blood and unrest. Civil war, betrayals, and the ever-present shadow of assassination shaped her childhood. In such an environment, personal hygiene was a luxury no one thought to afford. Survival, not soap, was the priority. The royal court into which Isabella was born was not a glittering court in the modern sense, but a mobile encampment. It moved from fortress to fortress, castle to castle, consuming resources until the land around it was exhausted, then shifting onward like a swarm of locusts. Imagine thousands of bodies, nobles in brocade, soldiers in steel, priests, servants, horses, dogs, all crowded together. The air thick with smoke from cooking fires, chamber pots sloshing with waste, food scraps thrown to snarling dogs under the tables. Horses relieved themselves in courtyards where children played. In winter, with windows sealed against the cold, the stench grew unbearable. To modern eyes, it was not the world of kings and queens, but of camp followers and stables. For Isabella, this was normal. To grow up in the stink of unwashed bodies, the buzz of flies, and the cry of hungry animals was to grow up in what passed for royalty in 15th-century Castile. Yet she did not merely endure it, she internalized it. Filth was not a mark of shame. It was the odor of authority, the scent of power on the move. But when Isabella was 17, she witnessed an event that would sear her beliefs into permanence. The winter of 1468 brought plague to the Alcazar of Segovia, where the court had settled. First came the rats, staggering out of the walls in daylight, their fur clotted with sores. Then the fleas, abandoning their dying hosts, leaping desperately onto new bodies. Within days, the disease had its first victims. Servants shivered with fever, then bloated with buboes, black swellings in their armpits and groins, oozing blood and pus. The cries of the dying echoed through stone corridors. Physicians in grotesque bird-beaked masks stalked the halls, clutching pouches of herbs they believed could ward off the miasma. Isabella, still a teenager, watched the court unravel. Proud knights whimpered like children as their bodies broke down. Dignitaries who had debated policy with her father days before now lay moaning in their own filth. Death came swiftly, and no prayer or potion could halt it. Yet one detail lodged itself in Isabella's mind, twisting her view of the world. It seemed, to her eyes, that those who perished were not the grease-stained scullions or the stable boys who slept in hay, never bathing, always reeking of sweat and manure. No, it was the nobles, the courtiers who occasionally washed their hands or wiped their faces with scented cloths, who died in shocking numbers. The dirtiest, the ones who never knew soap or scented water, survived. To us, this was chance, nothing more than the chaotic spread of disease. To Isabella, it was revelation. Cleanliness did not save, it killed. Dirt was not weakness, but protection. God, she believed, spared those who trusted him and punished those who sought worldly remedies. In her youthful mind, sanctified filth became a shield. The lesson was simple, brutal, and permanent. Dirt was divine. This conviction did not grow in isolation. Around her, the mystics and theologians of Spain preached similar messages. To wash was to strip away God's baptismal protection. To perfume the body was vanity. To endure the natural odor of sweat, blood, and tears was to share in the suffering of Christ. For Isabella, the plague of Segovia was not only a tragedy but a dark education, one that would shape her for the rest of her life. In her young heart, a dangerous idea took root, that holiness could be measured not by cleanliness, but by filth. And as she rose to power, she would carry that lesson with her, until it seeped into every corner of her reign, and every thread of her white linen shift. By the time Isabella assumed her place as queen, she no longer saw filth as an accident of circumstance. It had become a deliberate choice, a weapon of faith. The Spain of the late 15th century was awash with mysticism. Its saints and visionaries celebrated not for earthly beauty or refinement but for their willingness to degrade the body in pursuit of the soul. Catherine of Siena, one of the most revered mystics of the age, was said to have starved herself into visions and once drank the pus from plague victims' sores as an act of devotion. Francis of Assisi, centuries earlier, had embraced lepers and refused to wash the dirt from his hands. To the medieval mind, these were not acts of madness but proofs of holiness. The body was a prison, a site of temptation and weakness. To defile it, to wound it, was to free the soul for God. Isabella followed this path with a terrifying fervor. At least 3 times a week she shut herself in her private chapel. There, stripped to the waist, she took up a knotted cord whip. Each strike raised welts across her back and shoulders. Blood ran in thin rivulets, soaking into the linen that clung to her skin. The pain was not punishment, but purification. Each lash brought her closer, she believed, to Christ's own suffering. Her garments, stiff with sweat and blood, ceased to be mere clothing. They became relics, repositories of sanctity, woven not only with flax but with the Queen's sacrifice. This belief was not unique to her. Linen itself carried powerful symbolism in the medieval Christian imagination. Unlike wool or silk, born of animals, linen sprang from the humble flax plant. It was the fabric of shrouds, the cloth of angels, the material in which Christ himself was wrapped upon burial. To wear it next to the skin was to encase oneself in purity. But when linen absorbed the fluids of the faithful, the sweat of labor, the blood of flagellation, it became charged with spiritual force. The longer it was worn, the more it was believed to embody the wearer's holiness. Isabella's shifts were soaked with this meaning. Stained with tears, oils, blood, and unwashed grime, they were no longer undergarments but sacred talismans. To cast them aside, to replace them with fresh linen, would be to cast aside the very marks of her devotion. In the filth, she believed, lay her power. Such devotion was reinforced by the teachings of confessors and clerics who surrounded her. They praised mortification of the flesh, telling her that discomfort and rot were ladders to heaven. To endure stench and sores without complaint was to imitate Christ more closely than gold crowns or jeweled crosses ever could. The court whispered, too, of other holy women. Maria de Santo Domingo, who allegedly never washed her hands for 30 years, Catalina de Cardona, who wore the same hairshirt until it stiffened with filth and blood, standing upright on its own. For Isabella, these were not tales of horror, they were precedents, examples to follow. She was not only queen by blood but chosen by God, and if God demanded she suffer through dirt and fleas, then she would embrace it as her divine duty. By the time the war for Granada loomed, her theology of dirt and suffering had hardened into certainty. Her body was no longer hers, but God's instrument. Her garments were no longer fabric, but relics. And her pain was no longer humiliation, but proof of sanctity. It was this mindset that shaped her vow during the final crusade of the Reconquista. For Isabella, refusing to change her linen was not an eccentricity, nor a myth born of gossip. It was the ultimate prayer, stitched into cloth, worn against the skin, carried into war. In April 1491, the final chapter of the Reconquista began. The last Muslim stronghold of Granada stood defiant, its red walls of the Alhambra shining in the Andalusian sun. For 7 centuries, Christian kings had pushed southward, slowly reclaiming lands once ruled by Islamic emirs. Now Isabella and her husband Ferdinand were determined to finish the work. The fall of Granada would not only complete the Reconquista, it would crown their reign with divine legitimacy. According to the legend, before this decisive siege Isabella knelt before an altar and made a vow: she would not change her linen shift until Granada fell. To us, the idea seems grotesque. To her, it was a sacred contract. Medieval Christians often bargained with God through vows, promising hardship in exchange for victory. Such promises were considered binding, breaking them risked eternal damnation. If Isabella indeed made this vow, she was not merely demonstrating piety. She was staking her soul upon the conquest. From their new city of Santa Fe, constructed outside Granada's walls, Isabella and Ferdinand orchestrated the siege. Unlike reckless charges of earlier crusades, their strategy was patient, methodical. They tightened the noose, cutting off supplies, starving the city into surrender. Soldiers dug trenches, erected wooden watchtowers, and filled the night with the clang of hammers and the reek of campfires. Tens of thousands lived in close quarters, unwashed, coughing, sweating beneath the Andalusian sun. The heat was merciless. Dust coated every breath. Smoke from endless cooking fires choked the air. Flies swarmed over the refuse of men and horses. In this setting, Isabella's vow, if true, was an ordeal beyond imagining. Her linen would have been heavy with sweat by day, clammy by night, stiffening with salt and grime. Fleas thrived in such conditions, biting and multiplying until every prayer was punctuated by the itch of torment. Visitors to the queen during these months described her as gaunt, her face sharpened by intensity. She was said to pray for hours before a portable altar in her tent, refusing comfort, driving herself deeper into exhaustion. To those who saw her, there was something otherworldly in her presence, a mixture of sanctity and madness. Some claimed she smelled not foul, but strangely compelling, like old leather mixed with dried herbs, an odor both human and unearthly. The fleas that crawled upon her body would not have been regarded as mere vermin. In the medieval imagination, fleas were symbols of the devil, miniature demons gnawing at the faithful. Each bite was a test, each itch a trial. To endure without complaint was to prove one's devotion. For Isabella, every moment of discomfort became prayer, every sting of pain transformed into a sacrifice for victory. But beyond devotion lay something darker. Prolonged exhaustion, lack of sleep, hunger, and filth can fray the mind. Reports circulated that Isabella experienced visions, saints whispering in her ear, angels appearing at her bedside, voices guiding her military decisions. To us, these might seem like symptoms of religious psychosis. To her followers, they were proof of God's favor. Her madness, if it was madness, was indistinguishable from holiness. This fusion of piety and suffering rippled outward. Soldiers believed their queen's endurance would win God's blessing for them all. Her vow became a symbol. If Isabella could mortify her flesh for Spain, then surely they could withstand hunger and fear. Thus, her stained linen became more than clothing. It was a banner of faith, worn upon her body as surely as the cross upon her chest. The siege dragged on for 8 months. Granada's defenders weakened, their stores of grain dwindled, their walls no longer enough to hold back despair. Inside the city, hunger gnawed at noble and beggar alike. Outside, Isabella endured in her camp, her body breaking down but her resolve unshaken. In her mind, each day brought her closer to fulfilling not just a vow, but destiny. When we imagine Isabella during the long months outside Granada, her body cloaked in a shift that had not been changed in seasons, we see something more than private devotion. We see a paradox, a woman who degraded herself publicly, yet emerged stronger in authority. In the strange logic of late medieval Spain, filth could be power. For a queen, this mattered. Isabella ruled in a world where women's bodies were often viewed as sources of temptation, corruption, even sin. Female rulers risked being reduced to their sexuality, dismissed as pawns of beauty or seduction. But Isabella's vow, if true, dismantled that perception. In refusing cleanliness, she made herself repellent to desire. No man could speak of her as merely a woman when she cloaked herself in sanctity, her very stench a shield of authority. Her dirtiness desexualized her, granting her the freedom to rule without suspicion of softness. Her example trickled down into the court itself. Nobles began to mirror her disdain for hygiene, wearing their own unwashed state as a badge of loyalty and piety. To remain filthy became a form of courtly conformity, a sign that one belonged among the queen's chosen. Foreign ambassadors recoiled. The Venetian envoy Pietro Martiri wrote in disgust that to approach the Spanish court required not just courage but a strong stomach, so overwhelming was the odor. The French diplomat Philippe de Comines noted, with thinly veiled horror, that Spanish nobles seemed to wear their filth as if it were a mark of pride. But behind these courtly displays lurked real danger. Unwashed bodies teemed with parasites. Fleas did not discriminate, they carried plague in their bites, and lice spread typhus. Within the packed halls of royal castles, infestations spread like wildfire. The very garments that Isabella treated as relics, infused with the sanctity of her blood and sweat, could also harbor sickness that killed indiscriminately. To modern sensibilities, this is almost unimaginable. The most powerful court in Europe, breeding ground of empire, suffocating in its own odor. But within the logic of the time, Isabella's choices were not foolish, they were admired. Her filth was interpreted as proof of faith, her suffering as devotion. Even her paranoia, her visions, her whispered accounts of saints guiding her hand, were seen as blessings rather than signs of illness. And yet, there was always tension. Her filth was not only a shield, it was a weapon. By embracing what others feared or found repulsive, she inverted the hierarchy of shame. Nobles who might have mocked her instead bowed lower, for she had redefined the terms of holiness. In the dirt of her garments, she wielded control not just over her body but over her entire kingdom. Thus, Isabella's power did not only rest upon armies or treaties. It rested too upon a dangerous cultural belief, that to stink was to be sacred, and that holiness could be measured in layers of sweat and fleas. In her person, Spain's destiny was embodied. The sanctified filth of one queen became the model for a nation. On January 2, 1492, Granada surrendered. The banners of Castile and Aragon rose above the Alhambra, while the last Muslim ruler, Boabdil, handed the keys of the city to Isabella and Ferdinand. Chroniclers describe the queen riding into the city with the solemnity of divine victory, her eyes hollow with exhaustion but her posture unbending. According to the myth, it was only then, after 8 unbroken months, that she finally shed her shift. By then, it was said, the garment was so stiff with sweat, blood, and grime that it stood upright on its own, a macabre relic of piety hardened into armor. Whether this detail is true hardly matters. The story persisted because it spoke to the world's understanding of Isabella, not just as queen, but as saint, fanatic, and paradox. To her supporters, the filthy linen was proof of holy sacrifice, her suffering a ransom for Spain's triumph. To her detractors, it was evidence of obsession, a monarch so consumed by religious zeal that she lost touch with the boundaries of sanity. In either telling, the garment became a symbol, one that still clings to her memory centuries later. From Granada, Isabella turned quickly to new horizons. The same fervor that carried her through filth and fleas drove her to fund Christopher Columbus's voyage. Within months of the city's fall, the queen who might not have changed her underclothes in nearly a year was dispatching ships across the Atlantic, an act that would reshape the entire world. Thus, the myth of dirt and the reality of empire were bound together, threads in the same cloth of history. But the meaning of that myth runs deeper than one queen's vow. It reveals how medieval society blurred lines that we now see as clear. The body was not a vessel to be honored, but an enemy to be conquered. Cleanliness was not health, but vanity. Pain was not weakness, but proof of divine favor. In such a world, the sight of a queen cloaked in sanctified filth was not shocking. It was inspiring. And yet, viewed from our own time, the story is unsettling. We know now the consequences of neglecting the body: infections, madness, disease. We know that fleas carry death, that dirt breeds illness. What they revered as devotion, we see as danger. But therein lies the power of the myth. It forces us to confront how differently people of the past understood themselves, their bodies, their faith. Even today, the image lingers. In the shadows of the Alhambra, where fountains once shimmered for Muslim princes, the sound of church bells still replaces the call to prayer. The myth of Isabella's vow whispers through the centuries, reminding us that history is not just battles and treaties, but flesh and fabric, sweat and prayer. It reminds us that the line between holiness and horror, between sanctity and insanity, is often thinner than we imagine. The fleas that crawled upon her body are long dead. The linen she wore has crumbled into dust. But the story endures, passed from chronicler to court, from court to chronicle, until it became legend. And perhaps that is the truest relic of all, not the garment itself, but the belief it embodied. That in the filth of the body, one might find the glory of the soul.